so it's the Chicana movement in Ventura County. And I'll explain the title. And there's an image from the Star Free Press. Many of you probably remember the Star Free Press. And now it's the Ventura County Star. And there's a picture there of Cesar Chavez speaking somewhere in Ventura County, I think it was Oxnard, because it was a strawberry strike in 1974. So just wanted to open up with that. And there's the cover of my first book, Curious Unions. It's Mexican-American workers and resistance in Oxnard, which had a lot to do with Port Hueneme in regards to the history here with the port and the history that still yet to be flushed out and fully explained is Henry Oxnard with the Port of Hueneme and the Bard family, the leadership. Why? There's an unexplained, well, partially explained, in regards to the power struggle. And eventually, you have the Southern Pacific Railroad create a spur line in which centralized the sugar beet company, where it is, in northern Oxnard, 5 Points area, rather than here. Right? So history is always being rewritten. Right? So this is to say, there still needs to be a historian to flush out that history. What happened, to look into the archives, and what's the inside story of that. Right? So, and the book, which came out in 2012, starts from 1898, which is when the sugar beet company opened. And sugar beet was the industry in Southern California in the early 20th century. Going all the way to much of Southern California, particularly the areas such as the Oxnard Plains, because of the soil and the climate, and sugar is a major cash crop at that time. Then specialty crops came in, particularly citrus, right, and other crops, and later on in the latter 20th century, crops that made more money, like strawberries, for example, chiles, lettuce, right? Which overshadowed in terms of profits of what farmers could grow. Farmers just don't grow to grow, right? They grow to make money, right? So whatever's most profitable, they'll grow, right? And what is not as profitable will lead to other parts of the United States. So by the 1950s, sugar beets began to decline as a cash crop. And other crops emerged. So the book ended in 1961. And this is where the book 2 picks up, largely from 1961 to 1975. So it's more abbreviated in that regard. So one thing I've learned over the years in academia is self-promotion. So if you want to get the book, just go to Amazon or Barnes & Noble, online, or order it at a local bookstore, and they'll find it. Oh, great. The bottom two. Up and down. So let's see. And thank you, Barry. That's Cesar Chavez, the famous labor organizer that founded the National Farm Workers Union, and later was renamed by 1972, I believe, the United Farm Workers, UFW. And there he is in Oxnard, right? And that's by the Seaboard Packing House in Oxnard, right?
Yeah.
So if you go on Colonial Road, there you go. Yeah, so there you go. It's Lemons, right? And so it's off of Colonial Road, and I think it's Garfield that is on. Now that's a cashiered Quonset hut, right? Now if you go to that address, it's a home that's there right now. So it no longer exists. And this is about 1958. 1958. And if you see the background, it also served as for World War II veterans. This is the Latin American Veterans Club, right? And it was also a CSO office. The CSO stood for the Community Service Organization. It was one of the major organizations, early organizations, after World War II, in which Mexican Americans were organized in electoral politics in regards to voting. They were nonpartisan, but the idea was to get the citizens to vote, and also immigrants to be get residency if they didn't have legal residency, then to get citizenship as a service organization, and then to register new citizens and old citizens to vote, right? And by having them vote, having political power, right? The influence in places like La Colonia, right, for example, and other communities throughout California and Texas. So this is a Get Out the Vote campaign. This is Tony Del Bono. He was owned a nursery in Camarillo, was highly involved in Oxnard. Norma Gutierrez is there also, and I don't know who the other two are, but they had this vigorous campaign in getting out the vote and registering people. And one of the things that Cesar Chavez said, it doesn't matter who you vote for, just vote, because politicians are very sensitive to who votes, right? And he knew that only by voting that they could get in places like La Colonia back. They didn't have paved streets. They didn't have street lights, right? Amenities or things we take for granted in other parts of the city, La Colonia didn't have. Right? They were neglected, right? So it was by participating in voting that they sought to put pressure on elected officials. And one thing I have to emphasize about Cesar Chavez, he's known largely for his civil rights campaigns, and also like Gandhi and Martin Luther King, the notion of nonviolence. But his nonviolent approach was also a militant nonviolence, right? Like Martin Luther King was a militant, right? Because he believed in direct action, right? There was nonviolent direct action, like sitting in Woolworth counters, for example, marching, for example. Getting arrested, even though he didn't get arrested, for violating unjust laws, right? We had a good debate, a discussion on laws in my U.S. history class. Well, he broke the law. Well, when Martin Luther King wrote about the issue of protest in Birmingham jail, he talks about there are laws that are just, and there are laws that are immoral and unjust that warrant to be broken. Right? Like slavery was legal. Right? Women couldn't vote. That was legal, right? So in taking nonviolent strategies, he implemented militant action. One example of this for Cesar Chavez specifically was getting the whole community to attend a city council meeting. And they would call it jamming meetings. Jamming meetings and going to the public's comment section and berating elected officials. We want streetlights. We've been writing you, we've been calling you, and we still don't have streetlights, right? That's the form of militancy. It's nonviolent. And marching through streets is a form of militancy. So that we have to really understand. Even though it was nonviolent, it wasn't passive. It wasn't passive, right? And many times people confuse nonviolence as being a passive act, right? So getting out the community to vote was part of it. They would go to doors. They had these. They all have papers in their hands. They knew who the registered voters were. And if they weren't checked off at a poll, they went to their house. Hey, you haven't voted. get out the vote, get out the vote campaign, right? So they were very active, proactive. So then he left in 1959, because he had a contract to work to organize the community, the CSO. The CSO philosophy was you go into a community and you develop local leadership. And once the local leadership is developed, you leave. Because they didn't want the community to be dependent on a leader from the outside. They wanted local leadership to develop, to be more organic. And so they thought the Bracero program, which is a program that the U.S. government had to bring subsidized workers to displace largely domestic workers here, right? So there was a battle between domestic workers and imported workers, and they were both of Mexican origin, largely, right? So you had Mexican Americans and longtime Mexican resident immigrants who were working, who were battling braceros. Not so much the braceros, them too, but the growers, who benefited from a new cycle of workers that they could pay even less, right? And the domestic workers knew that they were being pitted against each other. That's why they were called contracted, subsidized workers, because the government was helping the growers in the citrus, growing the vegetables and the strawberries and other crops to bring in outside workers to depress the wage rate, right?
When was that? The federal government stepped in?
It was initially implemented in 1943. And it was just supposed to be for the wartime period, right? Because the idea was we have many veterans, many young men who are going off to war, and they created the myth, and it was a myth to a large degree, that there was a lack of workers, right? So they created the Bracero program to import workers from Mexico for the wartime period of World War II. But lo and behold, the war came and went, but the Bracero program stayed. And it stayed because the growers wanted that continuous influx of immigrant workers that they could pay less, right? Because when you're in a community and you're grounded, you can start making demands, right? Like, hey, I've been here for 10 years, this is my home, I'm not going to, I want more pay, right? But if you're an immigrant worker, you're less able to organize, you feel not as connected to the community. So this was an aspect of it. And Cesar Chavez's, one of his duties was to, as a CSO leader, was to develop local leadership, organize the community so they could combat the Bracero program. That wasn't decertified until 1964. So we have this temporary guest worker program, if you will, for World War II, but it lasted over 20 years. Right? Because the agricultural industry loved it. Right? You could have loved it. I could bring inexpensive labor, right? And so this was part of it. And Cesar Chavez wanted to continue this fight for agricultural workers. And the CSO said, this is not our charge. This is not what we're about. So in 1961-62, he left the CSO to start his own union for agricultural workers. Right? And his wife, Helen, had family in the San Joaquin Valley in Delano. So that's when they left in 1962 to Delano, because they had extended family support, because he was an organizer, and organizers don't make much money, right? So while he was organizing throughout the San Joaquin Valley, tapping into the leadership of the CSO that had been created there, recruiting true believers in his movement, his cause, Helen was working, right, providing for the family along with her mother and father and her brothers and sisters there, right? So that was part of it.
Does he have children?
Who, Cesar Chavez?
Yeah.
Yes, he has children. They're grown children now.
Have you ever heard anything in the news, either his wife or his children?
Well, his wife recently passed away, like 2 or 3 years ago. His daughter, one of his daughters was involved in becoming a politician. I don't know how far she went. And, one of his elder sons runs the Cesar Chavez, the foundation there. So part of the story is that what happens after Cesar Chavez leaves, right? And the labor organizing continues. People like Tony Del Bono, who's listed there, and Carmen Gutierrez, who's listed in the picture there, they continue to organize. Carmen Gutierrez becomes involved in Head Start, right? The War on Poverty program to provide early schooling for children and daycare. And what happens, many of these individuals that volunteered their time for service organization got government jobs. and they worked in places like Head Start. But part of the problem with that was great because now they got steady employment and government benefits to work in such agencies. But also they were forced to become apolitical. Right? Where if you're in the CSO, that's in an independent organization, you can take a political stance on things, right? But once you work with state or federal agencies, you can't play that role anymore, right? So in one way it was great. You got people that worked in war on poverty programs, but on another side, they became moderate. So we have in Delano by 1965 the grave strike, in which the National Farm Workers Association did not want to become involved with. Larry Itliong, Filipino labor organizer, started the strike, right? And so Cesar Chavez was put in a hard, difficult position, right? We're not ready for a strike. We're not organized enough. We don't have the foundation. But Filipino workers are going on strike, and if we continue to work, we're going to undermine their labor dispute, right? So after this collaboration with the United Farm Workers Organizing Committee, and it's UFOC, AWOC, the Association of Working Organizing Committee, the Agricultural Workers Organizing Committee, so many acronyms. I got to keep a list in my pocket. So the Agricultural Workers Organizing Committee went on strike. Filipinos went on strike. So Cesar Chavez's union, the National Farm Workers Association, was put in the position either you're with them or you're going to be against them, right? So we have a 5-year strike. It's a prolonged strike. It takes forever, right? But this is one of the early movements of the Chicano movement. Cesar Chavez did not identify himself as a Chicano. These labels are being experimented with. He was more of the Mexican-American generation. Or this is the complexity of identity. Many people of Mexican origin, even though they were longtime citizens, they had parents and grandparents, many great-grandparents that were born and raised in the United States. They view themselves as Mexican, right? For many reasons. They lived in areas in which they were forced to be segregated, right? In barrios and also colonias. And in those segregated areas, the dominant language was Spanish. And you had immigrants and longtime residents and longtime citizens and so forth in shared space. And they identified themselves as Mexican. So this issue of identity is it's here, and it's back and forth, and it moves over here, right? Because it's a dynamic environment. And they're in these areas because they're forced to live there. One of the documents that I show my students is, maybe many of you remember, is restrictive real estate covenants. Restrictive real estate covenants prevented blacks, Asians, Native Americans, prevented Mexicans from living in white neighborhoods. So even if a seller would sell you the home, it was in the deed that the homes could not be sold to non-whites, right? It reminded the movie with Sidney Poitier, A Raisin in the Sun. is about that, right? So if you've seen that classic movie, it talks about restricted real estate. They want to move into a middle-class neighborhood out of the city, but they're prevented from living there. Same thing happened not only in the South, because usually segregation is looked upon as a Southern, the anomaly of the United States. No, this was throughout the United States. So with that in mind, and it wasn't just the deeds of real estate agents, for example, banks, insurance companies, all collaborated in redlining, not showing homes, not providing mortgages, even though they had the jobs and the credit scores to apply. It was a systematic segregation of people. So as a result of that systematic segregation, they viewed themselves living amongst immigrants and not living with the general population as Mexican. And World War II changed that a lot, because a lot of them went off to the war, sacrificed their lives and limbs, and they also got to see other parts of the world. In France, for example, where the discrimination was not so blatant. It was an example of a different way to live. And other non-white communities also experienced that, right? So they began to demand their rights and privileges as Americans, but being Mexican American, right? And Cesar Chavez grew up in that age, right, of the Mexican American. And they went back and forth. Right? And amongst historians, there's this discussion of becoming Mexican American, right? So we have the grape strike. Then you have other movements that are taking place in Colorado. It's known as the Crusade for Justice campaign by Jorge Gonzalez. In New Mexico, Reyes Tijerina is fighting for the reestablishment of Spanish land grants that have been taken away from Mexican people. It's known as the land grant movement. And also in Texas, you have the Raza Unida Party, and particularly in Crystal City, Texas. Many of these, a good movie to see in which, all I just finished talking about is to watch Giant, right?
Yeah.
With Rock Hudson and also James Dean and Elizabeth Taylor, right? It gives you a good sense of what it was like to live in the 20th century America, right? In which you have this stark, discrimination, racism that's there. And in Texas, what happens in Crystal City, Texas, as a result of this new sense of being American, they have these voter campaigns of registration and get out the vote, and they took over city councils, they took over school boards, right? They took over many of the elected posts, and it scared a lot of people. It's like, whoa, we're not used to, having Mexican Americans in positions of power, right? And that was inspiring for many young people of the 1960s, just like the grape strike was inspiring. Because for the person of Mexican background, immigrant and American citizen, they were always in a subordinated role. They were always taking orders, not giving orders, right? They weren't in positions of power. They weren't teachers, right? They weren't professors, right? And to see that they were winning, right? They were getting higher wages and basic rights like having bathrooms in the fields, right? Having to wash your hands at break time. Just basic human things that we take for granted, right? Having representations on school boards. The students that came of age, the baby boomers, right? The baby boomers that were born in 1945, by 1965, they're 20 years old, right? And they're energized by what's happening in Delano. They're energized by what's happening in Colorado with Jorge Gonzalez and his campaign, Crusade for Justice, and the walkouts in Los Angeles. Students were walking out because they were not being geared for college. Right? They didn't have books, right? They had teachers that were extremely racist towards them, would track them to menial labor jobs, right? So as a result, we have a famous counselor, Sal Castro, saw this, and he was of the Mexican-American generation era, right? And as a Mexican-American, he began to organize students to protest. And by 1968, in East Los Angeles, you had this massive multi-high school walkout in protest of the inferior conditions, the inferior education that people of Mexican origin were getting, right? And they were called blowouts. And they were just boycotts. Just like you would have a grape boycott, don't buy grapes. You had to boycott a school, don't go to school. Right? And you say, what's the utility of that? Well, you have ADA, average daily attendance. And if the average daily attendance drops, the schools aren't getting money. Right? So it wasn't just a walkout, to have a day off, right? But it was to hit them where it hurt. Just like to hit the grape industry where it hurt, don't buy grapes, right? Don't go to school. And this captured the attention of the school board, and reforms were made, right? So that was in East Los Angeles. Then you had the Vietnam War, the war that was highly controversial as it progressed into the 1970s, right? And that was another issue that came up, and in which the war in Vietnam, and many civil rights workers were saying, well, there's a war in our own home, right? In our own, the fight is here for equal justice. Our fight is here for equal education. Our fight is here for, to buy a home where we want to buy, right? Why are we going off abroad when we don't realize these freedoms and liberties in the United States? So there's another book for you to read. It's called Blowout. Sal Castro and the Chicana Struggle for Educational Justice. The professor that wrote the book is Mario Garcia, and he's a UC, in case you want another speaker to come visit you, he's a UC Santa Barbara professor. There we go. Okay, so this is what I do, right? So you have these movements that are going around throughout California and Texas and the Southwest and the United States, right? This is part of the civil rights era, right? And so there's a milieu, there's an environment in which there's a certain spirit in the air that's happening with the black civil rights movement, and afterwards the women's movement. They're starting to draw connections with each other, right? So my contribution to the conversation of history is where's Ventura County in all this, right? Ventura County is overshadowed largely by Los Angeles County, right? And then you have communities. The city of Los Angeles overshadows other communities throughout Southern California. So my contribution to this story is to where is Ventura County? And so I went on Google Maps and I did a screenshot. So here is East Los Angeles, and then you can look at UCLA is around here somewhere, then Cal State Long Beach. And then you have UC Santa Barbara. So in the middle between Los Angeles and Santa Barbara, there is no public university. Right, and I say that because that means affordable university, right? As opposed to private university that costs more, right? So there's no public university. So if people want to go to school or send their children to school that are of humble beginnings with little money, right? Where do they go? Well, they either go to UCLA or they go largely to UC Santa Barbara, right? And if they want to transfer, they go to Moore Park College or Ventura College. And Oxnard College is not really established until 1974-75, right? So it comes later. So my focus is to look at what's happening in Ventura County when you have these movements going out through the United States, in Delano, for example, and these marches that occur from Calexico all the way to Sacramento. Where is Ventura County? Right? What's happening in Ventura? We already know that Ventura County was important in regards to Cesar Chavez establishing his reputation as a great labor organizer, a community organizer. This is where he really got his boost, right? We know that already. What happens afterwards? It doesn't die when he leaves, right? It continues with different individuals and organizations. And so one example of this is that young Mexican Americans, men and women, who are going to college, leaving places such as Fillmore, right? Leaving places like Purdue, Sadi Coy, for example, and Oxnard, and you name it, right? Anywhere in Ventura County, or Hueneme, right? Hueneme high school students, they're attending college. And many of them have sort of a hayseed mentality, right? They grew up in an agricultural background, right? Many of them haven't been to the city, right? They haven't been exposed to these larger movements, right? Many of us grew up in provincial backgrounds, right? Many in my community hadn't been to the beach, right? It's just 3 or 4 miles away, right? They live in their own little worlds, right? So they go to college and they're exposed to new ways of thinking, new environment, and higher education, and they see activism, right? And an example of this is at UC Santa Barbara. This is something I got off the internet. That's why it's blurry and really bad looking, right? In 1968, as part of the larger civil rights movement of African Americans, students there start demanding to know their history. Right? We're not learning about our history, our culture. They start to demand professors that look like them, right? That understand where they come from. And they make demands for recruitment of other African Americans and other support programs, counseling, what have you, that was absent for them. So a group of students who were part of the organization called the Black Student Union, they took over the computer mainframe building at UC Santa Barbara in 1968. And they took it over because you take over the computer building, you take over the whole university, right? And so they stopped the university in its tracks. Right? And they made demands. We want black studies, right? We want black professors, right? We want recruitment programs. We want tutoring. We want. And it wasn't we want, it was really we demand, right? Because nothing comes without a demand, right? You could ask for things, you won't get it. If you demand, then there's a higher level of urgency. And this example, many Mexican Americans and women and other Asian Americans saw this. This is bold, right? I mean, to make a demand, right? I like watching movies. And I came across a clip the other day of the movie, remember, Heat of the Night?
Yeah.
Right? There's that classic scene where, you have Sidney Poitier's character going to investigate a murder, right? And he starts asking questions, and he goes into, this southerner plantation owner's house, and the plantation owner slaps him, right? And Sidney Poitier does the thing that wasn't allowed back then, right? It would have got him killed. He slaps him back. Right? Right? Remember that scene? And so, but if you don't understand the environment of the United States of that time period, for an African American to do that would get him, not only him killed, probably his whole family. Right? So I bring that up only to highlight that what black students did at UC Santa Barbara was bold. It was unprecedented. then women and other minorities started saying, hey, we gotta make our demands too. And that's where the Moxie comes in, right? And the Moxie is, they had Moxie. And I got that from an interview of a person that went to out of Santa Paula, and she'll come up in probably the next slide. Who said that? You know, I asked her, Professor Julio Cunha says that you guys were bold and you were making demands, and she paused, looked down, and says, no, we had Moxie. Yeah, and that's where I get it rhymes with Mexican American, right? They're no longer Mexican Americans. They're Mexican Americans with Moxie. Where before it was Cesar Chavez was, well, let's go through the system, let's get voter campaigns, register voters, and if we have to, we'll jam the city council. But this was a higher level of militancy, right? We're going to take over buildings. We're going to take over institutions, right? So that's where the Chicana label comes in. They were Mexican Americans, but they were a different sort now, right? And they got it from observing others, particularly the black students. In Moore Park College, I go to student newspapers, and I was reading the student, and there was black student union students at Moore Park College. They went to the library. They saw no literature, black literature. You know, they saw that The Invisible Man wasn't there. You know, Pulitzer Prize wasn't in the book. There was nothing on black history. So they went into the library and started. They threw all the books in the library to the floor in protest, and also protested the lack of teachers and classes and so. And students from Oxnard, Ventura, and other parts of it who went to Moore Park College saw this and was like, whoa, what's going on here, right? And you have the Black Student Union and students, and Mexican American students were saying, what kind of organization do we have, right? Well, we have to create one now, right? So that's the significance of that. So here is San Fernando Valley State College. Anybody know the name of that college? Do you know? Northridge, right?
She's a graduate.
There you go. CSUN, Cal State University of Northridge. Before it was Northridge, it was San Fernando Valley State College, not even a university, college, right? And this changed in 1974-75. The name changed. And these are students at San Fernando Valley State that were protesting the Vietnam War. They were out in the library, and the administration warned them, if you start protesting, exercising your right to free speech, we're going to arrest you.
Yeah.
First Amendment right? And they said, well, it's our First Amendment right. And so one by one, they went to the podium, the lectern to speak, and as they started to speak, they were arrested. Then another person walked up to the podium, started to speak, and they were arrested. So what you have here are students, BSU students, Black Student Union students, with the Black Power sign, who are getting arrested. And that's an LA Times article picture, right? So, and here's Diana. She speaks to my classes. Diana Martinez. Borrego Martinez. Her name is Diana. Her father is Robert Borrego, highly involved in politics. Was a staff member for one of the state assembly members here, and also John Flynn. Also worked with John Flynn when he was a supervisor. And there's his daughter, and they said their daughter went to Catholic school in Santa Paula, good Catholic girl, and went there, and she got politicized. She got politicized by the movement, and so she participated in these protests. And if you look at her face, she's smiling.
Yeah.
She's like liberated. She's happy, you know. I mean, and that time period, to be in the movement as students, to be arrested was like that was your initiation, right? Yeah. So when I interviewed her, that's when I asked her, what's going on? We had Moxie. And she was transformed by attending, she went to the Newman's Club in Cal State, San Fernando State, but then she started attending SDS meetings, Students for a Democratic Society, right? Then she went to the United Mexican American Students Organization, right? And then she said that one of the turning points early on was going to a lecture given by Dick Gregory, right, who was a comedian, political activist of the time period, and that just reoriented her way of thinking. And she says, my roommate, when I walked back to my room, and my roommate said, "What happened, Diana? What happened to my Diana?" She was a different Diana. She was no longer the Diana who went to Catholic school, right? She was the Diana that was now Chicana. So now my job for my book too is to get that picture in a lot better quality. I have to go to the archives of the Los Angeles Times and ask for permission, which are not cheap.
No.
Permissions are expensive. Just to get a copy and get their authorizations could run anywhere from $50 to $1,000. Depends. If it's a public agency, they usually will ask for $50 for processing or something like that. But if it's private, it could be quite steep. So then the agricultural movement hits Ventura County. This person is Ben Aparicio. I interviewed him. He was a Moore Park College student. This is 1969. And citrus workers go on strike because they never knew what they were going to make at a day's wage. They didn't know what they earned until they got paid, right? And they demanded to know before the start of a picking of an orchard, what's the pay rate, right? And the growers, the ranch managers wouldn't tell them. So as a college student from the city of Fillmore, and being bicultural, right, growing up in the United States and knowing English and Spanish fluently, he became a leader amongst the pickers in Fillmore, Peru. And they lead this protest. And eventually they demand a union recognition, which growers will almost never do because they don't want to deal with a bargaining agent. They don't want contracts. They would rather deal with you one-on-one rather than as a collective. So through a prolonged strike of a few months, they were able to increase the pay rate and also know what an orchard was going to pay before it was harvested. And what happens is that this lapses. So you could have a victory one season, and the next season it's back to the same old business, right? So this is in Fillmore. And here's Cesar Chavez. There's Cesar Chavez who's lending his credentials, lending his imprimatur to the strike. Even though he's too busy with his own strike in Delano and also other parts of California, Salinas, he comes to Oxnard because he has roots here. He has a network in Oxnard, Fillmore, Santa Paula. He knows people, people know him. So in order to gather further public support, he's invited. And he speaks in Santa Paula. There's it's a Latino town hall, but they also have Casa Mexicano. Right, it goes back decades, in which that's sort of like a lodge for the Mexican American community, if you will. And he speaks there. Like, there are spaces in which he's welcome. Well, one place in the Oxnard Plain where Cesar Chavez speaks regularly, periodically, not regularly, is now what used to be Juanita School in La Colonia. Now it was renamed Cesar Chavez School. It's called Cesar Chavez School because that's where he went to speak to the community. The auditorium there, they have a mural of him there. So that was his home, right? And so when I go there periodically, I go, oh, this is the same room as Cesar Chavez was in. And I kind of have this connection, right? So there he is. Again, these are pictures from the newspaper microfilm. They're not even newspapers. I have to take a picture of microfilm, which itself is grainy and low low quality. So, and the Ventura County Star owns the rights to the Ventura County Star Free Press. So this hasn't been digitized, and the archive is not open yet. So it's going to be a job getting those pictures. And here is a parade float, and this is another aspect of the Moxie. In Santa Paula, they have a citrus festival, right? A citrus parade. So what takes place? We have the Friends of the Farm Workers. So we have people that are no longer agricultural workers because they sort of moved up a little bit, and they went from agricultural workers to maybe working in packing houses, or working from packing houses to work being truck drivers, right? Or being a carpenter. So there's this incremental mobility at times, not always. So you have many in the Mexican American community that are also intrigued and brought in by the farm workers movement. Right? So we have in Santa Paula, the citrus parade, right? And we have El Campesino Juan. That's El Campesino Juan, right? And we have here the Friends of the Farm Workers, Cynthia Escobedo, unknown volunteer, Frank Ramirez, Dora Duran, and here's Robert Borrego, Diana's father. Right? Diana's father, right? And they both speak to my class. They're going to be in my class in October. And one of the questions that was asked of them was, I said, Mr. Borrego, were you mad at your daughter for getting arrested? He said, no, I taught her. I taught her to protest, right? So there's Bob. And he closes his emails with Bobby. 90 years old, upon 90 years old, Bobby. Right? He's still young at heart. Right? So that's part of the sort of what's happening in Ventura County. The movement is here. It also shows you that there was a legacy of resistance. Because many look at the Mexican American as passive, apolitical, disorganized. And if you look at the history closely, and it's presented, you see there's a tradition. Like other people have a tradition of organization and resistance and mobilization. That exists. It's just that history is not investigated, and that history is not taught. Right? So what else? What are you led to believe? Right? So there's so much other history that needs to be not only studied but shared. That's why I'm really grateful to be here today to share what I've come across. A little more quickly, there's John Soria, came from a migrant family. Mother worked in the packing houses. Father was a migrant worker. And he leads a desegregation case in Oxnard. It's the Soria versus Oxnard School District. And there's a school named after Juan Soria here in Oxnard now. That goes back to these times. Because if you lived in a segregated community, because of neighborhood schools, your schools are going to be segregated. Right? So it was both, segregation was both de facto, of custom, tradition, but it was also legal. It was institutionalized by the real estate covenants, the deeds, right? And Judge Harry Pragerson, he's just retired. He's still on the bench, but on a part-time basis. A federal court judge found that there was de facto segregation in Oxnard, unofficial, right, of custom. If the Oxnard School District would have been smart at that time, they would have accepted the decision. But they appealed it. They said, we don't practice segregation in Oxnard. What's here is unofficial, it's of custom, it's just the way things happen, it's a result of the neighborhoods. So they appealed the case. And in the appeal, there's more investigation, right? Lawyers go into archives, they go into history, and they go into the district office and go into school board minutes. They find the legal part of it. They find the de jure part of the segregation. They find school board minutes in which the school board openly discusses, we gotta segregate Mexicans in their neighborhood. More or less, I'm not, they say it that blatantly, but they began to create neighborhood, I would say, districts, and also they even switched times in which school. And sometimes it was not logistically possible, oftentimes, to segregate. So what they did, it has different times of school. You know, the white students came from 9 to 12 or 9 to 1:30, and the Mexican Americans came from 1:30 to 3:30. Or even with the schools itself, like Wilson's School off of C Street, was basically two campuses in one campus. Well, you know, it was segregated by inside itself. Right? And the school board minutes of 1934 demonstrated that design by the school board. Right? So, and that's the importance of Soria. And another aspect is, usually when we talk about segregation of the schools or segregation of communities, we're thinking about Brown versus Board of Education, Topeka, Kansas, right? Or Mississippi, right? Or in Texas, right? Like in Giant, right? No, it's right here in Southern California. This was pervasive throughout Southern California. And we have a different iteration of that today. Right? It's more economics based, right? Because these legacies don't go away overnight. And the Brown Berets and this is a Rachel Murguria Wong. Rachel Murguria, her parents were involved in the citrus strike of 1941. They moved out of Ventura County in Santa Paula in 41 and went to go live in Monterey Bay, in Cannery Row, actually. And eventually she goes to school at UCLA and marries her husband, who was from Hong Kong. Right, so that's where the Wong comes from. Right? And she comes back as Rachel Wong. And she runs on the school board as Rachel Wong, but many people believe that she's Asian American, right? Or Chinese. Yeah, and right, but her name was Rachel Murguia Wong, right? And she was a Chicana. She went to San Fernando Valley State College. She got her master's degree, or an additional BA degree in Chicano studies. She already had a degree from UCLA, now she got a second degree. And she ran for the school board. And as a school board, she won. She was one term because she was so, she advocated so strongly to desegregate that she didn't win the next election. But my point is that she was, it was one of the people that had Moxie, right? And there she is with her husband, the young Rachel. I got to interview her also. And she wanted to become a Brown Beret, but because of the sexism in the Brown Beret, they didn't allow her to be a member, right? But the Brown Berets were also, there was kind of like the Black Panther Party. For self-defense, I always want to emphasize for self-defense, right? These are all militant or for violence. No, they're for self-defense against violence, right? So the Brown Berets, but they were like the Black Panthers. They had after-school programs. They had breakfast programs for students, and like the Black Panthers, they're different. But the Black Panthers, they had they were kind of like Meals on Wheels before there were Meals on Wheels for the elderly. The Black Panthers, right? So all they know is about these competitions with the police, but behind the scenes in their community, they were organizing the community, having breakfast programs, having senior citizen programs, and educational programs, and the Brown Berets followed that template to a large degree. So what you have in that image, another grainy newspaper image, are Oxnard Brown Berets. And if you look closely enough, you'll recognize some names, right? They're having a puppet show in a La Colonia school.
Same one?
The same one? And Andres Herrera is another person.
Oh, yeah.
So they're having puppet shows. They're going into elementary schools and showing and giving their history to students by way of puppet shows. How militant, right? Right? It just breaks all these stereotypes of what these young Chicanos were doing. And they're going into schools, high schools, and recruiting students from high schools to go to UC Santa Barbara. go to Moorpark College, go to San Fernando Valley State, right? Because there were many of the counselors, and this is still happening today, many of the counselors were discouraging them from going to college. Oh, you know, you really should think about. Yeah, you really should think about. It's an honorable occupation. You still see that.
You say you want to consider one, getting married,
Yeah.
have kids. They don't talk about something.
That's right. The history
Yeah,
doesn't change much. That's one of the things about history is there's two things that happen in history. There's change
Yeah.
and there's continuity. So you have this paradox, right? That the more things change, the more they remain the same, right? So the Brown Berets were going into the high schools, the elementary schools. They were having tutoring programs, and they were encouraging young women and men to go to Ventura College, to go to UC Santa Barbara, to go to San Fernando Valley State. That's the significance of that image. And we have the Chicana moratorium to protest the war in Vietnam. It's not just in Los Angeles. If you see, there's Mecha and Movimiento Estudiantil Chicano de Aztlán and Moorpark. This is Oxnard. This is Oxnard on B Street, and they're having this protest about 3 weeks after the protest in Los Angeles, the moratorium. Got a lot of coverage, and Ruben Salazar, the reporter that reported on many issues of Mexican American, he's killed in that, by the Los Angeles County sheriffs. They shot in a dark bar room where he was enjoying a beer after the protest. An LA County Sheriff deputy fired a tear gas canister into a room in which he was sitting. He hit him in his head. Killed him instantly. That tear gas canister was designed to penetrate concrete. And he was not indicted or prosecuted. So this is 3 weeks after that event. And the importance of Ruben Salazar, he was the voice of the Mexican American community. He was reporting on issues that other reporters were neglecting to cover. So there's a belief among many that this was an assassination. And we have also educators. This is Ray Reyes. That they're also inspiring students. So the Mexican American generation, the Chicano generation, it's not two distinct generations. Not working with, they're influencing each other. There's overlap. Right? There's overlap. So like Sal Castro, right, in LA. This is Ventura County's version of Sal Castro, right? And Ray Reyes, he was a counselor that came in from Los Angeles. And he inspires students about who they were as a people, who they were in terms of students, and also in regards to celebrating. Today is Mexican Independence Day, right? Independence from Mexico, from Spain, right? After 5 years of colonialism from Spain. So he and his students, like Mecha students, they have events of affirmation. They should be proud, where, not to be a Mexican, people were not conditioned to be proud of themselves. To be Mexican was something you downplayed, right? You called yourself Spanish, right? There's many restaurants of the era. They weren't Mexican restaurants, they were, Spanish food, right? Even though it was Mexican food, it was called Spanish food, right? Like I'm going to an event tomorrow, I'm going to make Mexican rice. For a long time, Mexican rice was called Spanish rice, right? Just to give you the level in which people, were not willing to accept who they were, right? And it was during the Chicano movement that people began to embrace their heritage. At the same time, being U.S. citizens, right? It was not an either-or proposition. You could be many things at the same time. And they did this through theater. So you had, they didn't have professors oftentimes that knew the history of their the community. So you have the like Teatro Campesino with Luis Valdez. So that many create their own teatros, right? At San Fernando Valley State, they have Teatro Aslan. And these students then start going to Moorpark College. They go to Ventura College. They go to different, LA region. They perform. They perform to affirm them, right, in their history. Just like Ray Reyes was doing as a counselor and as a teacher, they're doing as students to recruit them. And this is the march to copy, if you will, the march by Cesar Chavez, from Delano to Sacramento. You have Chicano students that start from Calexico, the San Diego Mexican border. They start from there, and they start recruiting, and they march from community to community, bringing students on board all the way to Sacramento. And one of the Brown Berets from Oxnard, Roberto Flores, as one of the organizers of the LA people, because Roberto went to UCLA, so he was connected with the Los Angeles movement. And he brought the movement into Ventura County. So they came through Fort Hueneme and the One, right? And they came through Oxnard, and they went to Sadi Coy, and from Sadi Coy they went to 126, and they went to all the communities up to Santa Paula, Fillmore, Paiute, and they started recruiting students. And they always sent an advance guard. They say, hey, we're having students coming in, can we have a place to stay? Can we have some food, right? So they integrated the community just like Cesar Chavez did. So it's part of the organization, right? They were savvy. Right? So you see the banner, the Mexican flag, and also the Virgen Guadalupe, and the Calexico of Sacramento, and they arrive. Right? And there's another image there as they're going through different communities. And this is Yvonne de los Santos. She's from Sarico. So she was brought into to the march as they went through Sarico. And from the march, she then attended Moorpark College and East LA College, and then became a union organizer. So that's Yvonne. There's a picture of Yvonne. And through Roberto, I was introduced to her and able to interview her. So they make it there. That's it. Thank you.
You got questions.
I want to just share something. First of all, the real estate thing was still kind of like that when I moved here. October 1 is 41 years ago. I can't even believe it. And my late husband was born in Guatemala. So when we came here to look for a house, the real estate person took us first to those parking stalls. And my husband said, that's not where I want to live. So he was forced to bring us to a different neighborhood.
Wow.
But that was his first thing. And then the other thing I wanted to share was that, first of all, the thing with Oxnard College, I don't know if you know this or not, but they were the ones that wanted to develop first. But the college board said, if you do that, we won't get our colleges in Ventura and Moorpark, so we need you to wait. So that's why they were the last developing college. Now it looks like a university up there. I'm really happy with it. I am speaking for it because I used to administer the international student program when I had it there. And it didn't look anything like it does now. But I feel it's a great college. I graduated from there while I was working for it. And my 3 sons all graduated from there. 2 of them have master's degrees and 1 has a bachelor plus he's a commercial pilot. So I can attest to it being a very good college. But even now, there's a thought in this community itself, which is wrong, and the counselors in high school still will say, well, why don't you go to a 4-year college? That's one thing they still tell kids. And the other thing is they'll say, even the community people think Ventura is better. And I worked next door to Ventura College for 3 years in the district office when it was there. And all the colleges to me are great. They don't leave out us. That's my ad of the day.
Thank you. I know that really good.
My burning question is, when these families that live here and the grandparents, was it hard to become a citizen then? And now I know it's it's a huge debate on citizenship, but when you say they were encouraged to vote, were they citizens that could vote or not? And the people that worked in the fields and
Well, many of them were immigrants, so they couldn't vote. So, and citizenship is a process. I don't know what it was back in the 60s, but you're quite correct. It has become increasingly difficult. Where in the early 20th century, if you came up with without documentation, back in the early 20th century, there's a good book. It's called Impossible Subjects, I believe it is, by Mine a Guy. In the early 20th century, if you came from Europe or any other part of the world, there was a statute of limitations of being undocumented. All you had to do was stay here like 2 or 3 years and not get caught, and you got legal residency. For people from Poland, from Ireland, from different parts of the world, all you had to do was not get caught for 2 or 3 years.
and then you apply.
Then you apply, then you got citizenship.
Up until then,
So it really began to increase in regards to becoming difficult to become a legal resident, much if you came without being a legal resident, in the 1920s. 1924 exactly. It's called the Reed-Johnson Act of 1924. But going back to your original question, in terms of the 60s, in terms of farm workers and people of Mexican origin becoming citizens, there are national loyalties that people have, right? I mean, people that come from Mexico, they're just like if you were coming from Ireland, right? Or you're coming from Britain. Or imagine yourself going to another country and you being a U.S. citizen. Would you change your citizenship immediately? No, I wouldn't. It would be something, it would probably be a process, if I did at all, to relinquish my citizenship or adopt another one. So similarly, people of Mexican nationality or other nationalities, their citizenship is something they cherish and hold on to, all right? So it doesn't mean that they don't, right? But it's something that doesn't happen easily for themselves, and also systematically, it's difficult. I think up until recently, it was like 7 years process to become a citizen, right? So it's not something that even systematically can happen, right? But usually the children right away adopt American culture. I had children that went to the Rio school district, and you have an immigrant family population in the Rio school, Rio Real, they went there. And the children were speaking English right away. And I was saying, hey, hold on. I was telling them, right, hold on to your Spanish. Not so fast, right? Because something you lose. I used to be fluent in Spanish. Now I speak a little Spanish, By the time my grandmother was, before she passed away, I could only greet my grandmother. I could only ask her how she was doing. I could exchange pleasantries, right? And after that, it was like, me voy ahorita, adios, because that's all I had left, right? And it really hurt me that I couldn't carry a conversation because I had been Americanized. I was born in the United States, right? And that's sort of the process with immigrants in general. Whether you're from Asia, whether you're from Europe, Poland, by the second generation, the one that's U.S., they're fully integrated. So this idea that the immigrants don't integrate is a false idea. It's a lie. Yes?
Yeah, but is there some resistance? I noticed that people who've been here several generations in the United States, and the people who are just coming from Mexico, I feel sometimes there's a little tension there among the people who have established themselves here and went through the process versus the people who just come over from Mexico. Is that?
Sure.
Yeah. And
there are divisions. There are divisions amongst immigrant groups, and it's not just Mexican immigrants. It's also Irish immigrants and Italian immigrants. And, as you're raising that question, John, I'm reminded one of my favorite movies is The Godfather. Right? And there's that one example where Michael has to speak Italian. You remember that scene when he's dealing with the other mafioso that wants to kill his dad? And they're talking in Italian, Italiano, capisci? And he's talking in Italian, and at one point Michael gets frustrated. Remember that? And he just starts talking English. I want an assurance that you're not going to come and kill my father again, right? I'm not that kind of man. You can tell from my favorite movie. But my point, that scene is that you have these generational differences, and also differences among residency and citizenship and region, right? And like that's what the Bracero program was all about. You had long-time domestic workers, residents, U.S. citizens that resented the Braceros because they were being undermined economically, right? At the same time, many Braceros were marrying Mexican-American women, which Mexican-American men didn't particularly care for, right? Because that was competition, right? Hey, that was my date you took me. So there were all these different tensions and also collaboration, sympathy. It was a mixed bag of relationships, just like you would have in other groups of people.
Also, too, when I worked in the city of Oxnard during the 70s, we had some movements, Cecil Chavez coming down to the plaza and talking about United Farm Workers and stuff. And that was a dramatic time. It was a very dramatic time to go through. Seeing kind of the old way and the new, kind of like you say, the Moxie.
Yeah.
The Moxie standing up on all the people. It was kind of a scary situation because they had never been confronted with something like that. So they were kind of like, whoa, this is kind of freaking us out.
Yeah.
And like you said, some of the kids, like say from Colonial, I worked for City of Oxnard, I worked in Colonial Park. We took some kids from the Colonial Park area up to Lake Casitas, and the kids didn't know what a lake was. What's a lake? Is that the ocean? No, it's not the ocean. It's like, what's it? I had to kind of draw it around a little circle. This is the lake, and this is all the land around the lake and stuff. But it was really funny, that the kids didn't have a lot of opportunities. One thing we did was we took the kids over to the Northern Sound. The Northern Sound used to be here, and let them tour the ship. And the mothers and the fathers came back and said, "Thank you so much for showing our kids there's so much more out there in life." And a lot of it triggered said, "Hey, wow, this is more. The world's more than just Colonial.
That's right.
It's more." So, and they really appreciate it because they did open their minds, to all this other stuff in the world that had been experienced.
That's right. Thank you, John. Yes,
One
Eileen?
insignificant question. When did they get the roads in Colonia paved?
Good question.
We haven't done it yet.
I know it's still a battle going on in this Oxnard Council.
Well, it's usually like the 50s and 60s. It was a process. It wasn't like overnight all of them were. But over time, the big thing was street lights. Because in La Colonia there used to be a lot of canneries and food processing, and they ran all day and all night. And many of the women had to walk home in La Colonia without any streetlights. Right, so that was when they had frozen foods in Oxnard. And just to give you a sense of the continuity, the change in continuity, I mean, many of